Welcome to a new episode of Ready to Launch, a special podcast series on entrepreneurship in the MENA region, a collaboration between Riyada, a Wilson Center podcast, and the Straight Up Startup with Rajai Sahouri in Amman, Jordan. I'm Marissa Khurma, Director of the Middle East Program here at the Wilson Center. So today we turn our focus to climate change and security in the MENA region, in commemoration of Earth Day that is celebrated April 22nd, with our very special guest who is both a social entrepreneur and environmentalist and activist, Safa Al Jayousi. According to the latest report by the Congressional Research Service, the MENA region is among the world's most water-stressed and vulnerable regions to climate change and its various impacts. And the worries that the report talks about amongst policymakers do not only include the physical and economic impacts of climate change, but also the potential implications for political stability and security in a very volatile region. But the hope lies in the work led by individuals such as Safa, who has been in environmentalism for more than 10 years, mobilizing, campaigning, and training at the grassroots level in Jordan and across the MENA region. So Safa, thank you so much for joining us. And I guess I will start with how eager I am to hear your story. You know, how did this all start for you? And what drove you to embrace environmentalism as your cause?
Well, I think it has been my passion since I was in school. And back then, like, I'm not too old, but back then we didn't actually learn about the environment that much in school. But then when I moved to university, I chose to study water management and environment. And then I started volunteering for a couple of international NGOs. And during that time, there was the discussions of the Conference of Parties in Copenhagen, which is one of the UNFCCC negotiations, which is the climate talks negotiations. And back then, I got heavily involved with both civil society actors and grassroots movements across the region. I reached out. And since then, around that time, I began to be an observer for the negotiations until the year after. I became an official observer for the climate change talks since early 2011. Mm-hmm. So I got into the field of observing what governments and other actors are doing on the climate change policy level. And I felt that our region is not that present. And it was present a lot and presented by the petroleum companies and a fossil fuels industry. Mm-hmm. And this is how then I wanted really to shift the thinking and to remind everyone in those closed rooms that they are actually deciding on our destiny and our behalf. So I started the trainings, and also I was heavily engaged with several civil society actors like Greenpeace, which I led their Arab World program, and a few other organizations until it led to the COP in Paris, in which we had a huge work in campaigning with Arab civil society, in which we trained and we worked with a lot the past 10 years. Mm-hmm. In order to have actually a Paris agreement, because one of the main blockers for the agreement was the Arab group in 2015. So this is how I got into it's both passion and interest, and also it interests me that how much we ignore the environment around us while we are in it. Yeah. So yeah, it's been a roller coaster, but it was worth it.
I'm sure. I want to go back to your time in high school, because you said that that's really where this passion started. Was there a specific class or teacher or campaign that was underway that sort of got you thinking about this differently?
It's actually more of interested more in geology, but then it shifted to the whole environment. Like everything that we are in is influenced by our actions. So this is how it moved. But in university, I had the most influence from my professors. So there are specific people who actually supported my vision and believed that I could do something.
That's wonderful, and it's great that the library had access to these books. So we have to thank that library for really inspiring you to do this important work. So climate change and the sort of the connection to security, not just sort of political stability, but also economic, social security, are really missing from the headlines unless there's a big conference happening somewhere, right? The likes of COPs and others. And you do a lot of this work with civil society, but how do you also try to engage the media to get the story going? It seems that unless there's a natural disaster somewhere that happens, that the conversation is not picking up, at least in mainstream media.
Definitely. So the first thing that I want to say is that climate change, as you said, is a cross-cutting issue. So you cannot talk about climate change in silo, or do you want to talk about climate change impact and the climate change resilience without talking about adaptation, nature-based solutions, about security, about the political scene? I can say that social media has played a great part in our work in campaigning. Because for a long time, a few media journalists were interested in that subject, and we worked with them a lot, and they are a great support. And I can say even the Paris Agreement won't pass without a comprehensive cooperation between media, civil society, governments who believe in the cause, actors like private sector, and philanthropists. So all of us came together under one umbrella to make it happen. Now, back to your question, we work a lot with media, and I did a lot of media trainings for media and journalists who needs to cover more, not just like the headlines, but also to have more investigative journalism in our region, because we lack that when it comes to environmental issues and climate change in specific. Unfortunately, we still have a few. So from my experience, the journalists, once they show interest in that, sometimes the editor doesn't, like usually they are not interested because it doesn't pick up that much audience, obviously. And also because always environment and climate change come, it's not a priority at all. So the same journalists would be covering politics, would be covering, for example, municipalities, elections, and climate change on the side.
Yeah.
We have very few climate change or environmental journalists in our region. They are really good, but they are very few.
Thank you so much, Safa. Indeed, the media needs to highlight these issues. It is not really just a luxury. And given that your work is focused on civil society, I'm curious to know whether you have successful discussions with policymakers and decision makers at the government level. Do they take the work that you do seriously at the civil society level?
Yeah, well, this is a very risky question that I need to answer in a very diplomatic way, huh?
Sure.
So, no, I just want to say that part of my job and my daily job is to do advocacy, and the main advocacy is with the governmental sector. So this is what I do the past 15 plus years. And it depends on the government, it depends on the country, and it depends on the people. When I started at first, they didn't take us, like, at least for me, they didn't take me seriously because I was too young. I was a female, also an Arab female, and too young. But then when I built the relationship, the reputation, and that my work has proven that it's good, I got a better way. And also I learned a lot because with each year by year, you learn more and more advocacy tactics and you build your network. So it's become not easy, but easier for me to advocate, because also 15 years ago, it wasn't, people didn't see the direct impact of climate change that they are seeing now.
Yeah.
And this has, unfortunately, helped us a lot. Like, we didn't want to see this happening in order for the government to take climate change seriously. Also, technology has been very creative and it's getting cheaper and cheaper. I'm talking about mitigation under climate change, which is basically renewable energy. So things has been colliding and going in that direction. It's been definitely challenging, but like as we saw, like in Copenhagen, or as we see on the national level governance, because if there is a policy in a place or legislation for climate change, it's not really implemented. And we saw that when the government submitted their NDCs, the national determined contributions. When you see the NDCs for the Arab region and the government, it's conditional to fund. So the governments basically are saying, if you are paying us this amount of money, we will reduce our greenhouse gases.
Yeah, so it's that conditionality gives them an incentive to take these things more seriously.
Definitely. So we work a lot with donor countries as well.
Yeah, and that's very effective on the part of the donor community. So it's definitely good that they've injected that conditionality. Now, speaking of civil society activism across borders in the MENA region, do you work with other groups, in Egypt, Tunisia, Lebanon? And do you coordinate efforts? So for example, for the upcoming COP in Egypt, in Sharm el-Sheikh, do you get together and decide on sort of the priority areas you want to focus on? Is there sort of like, environmentalists beyond borders kind of work?
So I'm really proud of the work that I founded before. So we did two things the past few years. Before the COP in Doha, Qatar, I was one of the founding members of the Arab Youth Climate Change Movement, in which it actually has over, like now, thousands of youth from the Arab region who work together on climate change, either policies, implementation on the national level, so country by country, sub-regional and regional. And just in 2014, I was a board co-chair of a big organization called the Climate Action Network, which has around 1,000 NGOs under it, like WWF, Greenpeace. And during that time, I realized that there's no coordination in the Arab region. So we created the Climate Action Network Arab World, which now has over 1,400 NGOs, not necessarily working on climate change as a core thing, but some of them, for example, in Morocco, working on gender and climate change, and the human rights and women's rights. So it depends. Any NGO who fits a specific criteria, who at least wants to work on climate change, can join this network. And we gather in Lebanon for the Bilad Sham countries, and we gather in Morocco or Tunisia or whatever country in Morocco, in Egypt. So there is, and this is one one network that I proudly founded with many partners, but there are multiple other networks who I didn't necessarily found, but they are working also on that sphere. So there is definitely coordination, informal and formal, across the civil society. But of course, there is also coordination on the national level. One great example that Moroccan NGOs came up with, Climate Justice Coalition, that has all the civil society actors who not necessarily work on climate change alone, but on human rights, on resources, on agriculture, and trade unions. So this is a successful national example as well.
And that just exemplifies how really it's not so narrowly defined working on the environment, because you have to be able to work with others, because ultimately all of this is interconnected. I want to go back to something that you mentioned earlier, and then you also highlighted women's rights and the intersection between climate change and gender in Morocco. And this is, I think, a topic that deserves a lot more attention because of the specific impact of climate change on girls and women, and the important role that women play in general in their communities in water management, for example. But you rarely see women at the negotiating table when it comes to water negotiations between governments. So, and you have experienced this sort of treatment because you are a woman environmentalist. Tell us a little bit about, your own experience, but how you see also this shifting a little bit.
Also, Marissa, I want to touch base on something that the environmental field is not, especially the negotiations, it wasn't a safe space before. Like we had, imagine for 2 weeks, 24/7 in the same venue. It was also hard for women to leave their children for 2 weeks, for example, because it's very hectic for women. And usually men, it's easier for them to travel for 2 weeks to spend, and it's 2 weeks the negotiations. Of course, you need to travel before and after for the pre-negotiations and the other intercessions. So it hasn't been easy. And I think the only reason that I was able to do it because I was delaying having a baby. To be very honest, because I couldn't. And now, for example, the past COP and the next COP, I won't be able to be there because I'm a new mom, and I can. And there's no place for women with the children in the negotiations, which is very sad. And it's the same goes for young women from the Yongo and the youth, because it's a very older male dominant negotiations. And I've been there to support. A lot of people have been there to support, but it's really hard for young women to be in the negotiations with all those governmental actors. It's now getting easier. I think the UN and others are getting aware, especially with the huge youth movement. But I won't say it's easy, to be honest. This is one thing. The other thing is the actual impact on climate change. If I want to have a climate change action, I need to hear it from the most vulnerable communities, and from women, children, and girls, because they are the most vulnerable to climate change. And we saw that in climate change also is a factor for conflict. And in conflicts, also women and children who are the most vulnerable. So it's a vicious cycle in which if you want to have a real action on the climate change, you need to have those people on the table. But to be honest, the past few, from Paris and beyond, even the negotiators from our region, we are seeing many wonderful, brilliant women who are speaking on behalf of their countries. And this just makes me so proud that it many people paved the way for those women to be there. And because they are good, of course, and they are brilliant. So you can see countries like Saudi Arabia, like UAE, like Egypt, like Tunisia, like Lebanon. There are brilliant women who are speaking on behalf of the government, but again, it's not enough.
Yeah, but like you said, it's very encouraging development that you have women representatives from these governments at these global fora. And congratulations on your newborn as well. It just goes back to our discussion in other episodes about the importance of childcare services and institutionalizing that, in fact, in the workplace, so that it is easier for activist mothers, working mothers, to be able to do the important work that they do as yourself. So I guess moving further along to the setting the agenda for COP Sharm el-Sheikh, how is it that you may not be able to be there, but how is it that you're helping or prepping civil society actors to be at the table and to present the work that they're doing?
So there are a couple of multiple ways, but one of the things that the governments in the region, because the COP is in our region for 2 years now, it's now in Egypt, and the next year it's going to be in UAE.
Right.
And because of the whole, I think, the revolution, let's say, the past few years in the understanding of climate change and how it's impacting the countries, there is a lot of progress when it comes to the civil society governmental relationship. So you will see in the negotiations themselves, you see the negotiators, usually we call them the pink badges. They hold pink badges. You'll see a lot of civil society actors holding pink badges. So Tunisia, Morocco, Jordan, Egypt, Lebanon, a lot of countries have been inviting civil society to be part of their delegations so they can get into closed rooms. So this is one tactic for us to actually influence the negotiations and to be engaged, because if you are having a civil society badge or civil society access, you won't be able to hear whatever is happening inside, because sometimes they just block civil society and journalists from coming in. So this is a tactic that we use a lot. We also have now a lot of meetings to discuss our messaging and the public narrative that we want to show and we want to speak about. And of course, we are working with media, preparing people to talk to media. So there are multiple angles, and we are doing a mini campaign as well. So there are multiple ways and tactics that we are using. Definitely, there is a lot on the national level happening, but also we want to collide what is happening on the national level, on the regional level, and then on the international level. So, and this COP is going to be interesting because it's hosted by Egypt. Egypt, a very strong country in the African group,
right?
And they are really, and they want to talk like what we heard from the Egyptian government and from other actors is that this COP is the adaptation COP, and it's the finance COP, in which it's going to be like a real African COP.
Okay. Yeah, we look forward to those discussions, and glad to know that you've been prepping and using different tactics to do so. In fact, one of our global fellows, Peter Schwarnstein, recently wrote about the role of civil society for the new security beat. So we'll be sure to share that with you, Safa.
Yeah, sure.
So we want to wrap up the conversation. And I guess one thing that we do, Rajai and I, when we, sort of close these episodes, is ask our guests to share before you launch sort of words of wisdom to highlight the key learnings from your journey so far. What advice would you give, particularly young ones? And you talked a lot about the role of youth in environmentalism. What advice do you give them, those who want to enter this field, as environmentalists and social entrepreneurs?
Yeah, definitely. So my advice will be is that when I talk to young people, and I'm mentoring many in the region, is that um, you need to be passionate about the subject. It's now trending, climate change and the climate resilience. But if you just riding the wave because it's trending, you will lose the momentum and the interest afterward, because there are a lot of ups and downs in this domain. So you need to have the passion, and you need to be motivated all the time. And also you need to support each other as young people, because this is how we build the momentum.
Yeah, absolutely. Working together is very important. Thank you so much for all the work that you do and for your
Thank you.
commitment to this cause, to your leadership. And we hope to see you in Amman very soon. Thank you.
Sure. Thank you.
This podcast is funded by a grant from the United States Department of State. The opinions, findings, and conclusions of this podcast are those of our guests and do not necessarily reflect those of the U.S. Department of State.